Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava, Kamma, Daf, Kaf. Today's stuff is sponsored by Tina and Shalom Lam with gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the occasion of the Brit and naming of their new grandson, Nadav Oz, born to their children, Bracha and Akiva Berger. Mazal Tov. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom of Yud Tet Amud Bet. We started with the whole idea of Shane and all different criteria of Shane, what makes something Shane, what turns it into keren. Remember, as soon as it's atypical, like eating clothes and food, clothes and vessels. Okay, that's not something typical to eat. Then it becomes keren. If it's keren, that already means chatzi nezek, right? Half damages. And usually it means, although we're going to have a question about this, that it's only that even in the public domain, you're responsible. Remember, you're not responsible for shane in the public domain. We've talked about this already many times. We assume the animal is going to eat food that's sitting on the street. And therefore, if you leave your food on the street, it's your fault for leaving it, knowing that animals were going to pass by. So now we ended with this whole question about shane eating, whether shane is eating regular food that the animal normally eats versus clothing and vessels. And then we said, well, where's the line in between? What if it eats typical foods that typical foods for one animal, but not the typical foods that animal normally eats? So we said, we brought a braita that basically says you're going to be liable for that as well. Okay. So now we're going to go to, can I see? I'm not sure. Is the right study guide up? Is the wrong one in the post? Let me know if you have the study guide. If you don't, then yeah, the study guide is up. Okay, great. Okay, let's start with Rav Papa. We're about 8 lines from the bottom of Yud Tet Amud Bet. Amar Rav Papa. Hashta da Amra. Now he's responding to the last line. Now that you just said Kol mili delab orche b'achlal yedei chak shmei achila. Anything the animal doesn't normally eat, but if there's nothing else to eat, they'll eat it, right? Think of kids who don't like to eat foods, but you know what? If there's absolutely no other food, they're going to eat what there is because otherwise they're going to starve, although you might have kids that don't do that either. But basically, right, since the animal will eat it, that's considered kedarko. Hai shunra da'achla tamre. So if you have a cat who eats dates, which apparently is very weird, I don't know, I don't have cats, I don't know what they eat, or a donkey that eats fish, mishalem nezek shalem. We're going to call that typical damages also. Now we're going to have a story. There was a donkey who ate bread, and the bread was in a basket, and he ate the basket or damaged the basket while he was eating, or we assume right now while he was eating the bread. Rav Yehuda says full damages on the food, on the bread, because he ate someone else's bread, but only half damages on the basket, because that's keren, that's weird. Animals don't generally eat baskets. So they say, what do you mean? Amai. What do you mean? If the food's in the basket and he's trying to eat the food, very likely the donkey won't pay attention and he'll chew away at the basket. So it should actually be part of shame, right? As part of the typical way of eating. To which they answered, it must be that first he ate the bread, and after there was no bread anymore, then he started chewing at the basket. That's why he only made him liable for half damages. But if in fact the basket was damaged while he was eating, then we would make him liable. Full damages for the whole thing. Now they ask a side question. Upat orchehu, but wait, bread is really not something that donkeys eat. Uraminu, how do we know this? Because it says in a Tana Idik source, again, this is classic. Instead of going to the street and do donkeys really eat bread or not, what they do is they say, wait, there's a source that seems to say donkeys don't. Now, why? Because it says if you ate, now it doesn't say who the subject of this braita is, but if they ate bread, bread and meat and a cooked dish, mishalem chatzi nezek. You only pay half damages because that's considered atypical. Again, atypical turns it into keren, half damages. Right? We're assuming this is obviously all in the domain of the private domain. Public, it wouldn't be, right? The truth is you would be liable, but we're trying to say is it shane or is it keren, full or half. So now, my liable behema, is this not in domesticated animals, which would include the donkey? And then it seems like that's not shane. Look, it's so atypical that it leaves the category of what we saw before. Some animals eat. No, this is so atypical. To which the Gemara says, lo, b'chaya. You could say it's talking about chayot, undomesticated animals. In which case, the domesticated animals would eat this kind of food, which makes sense maybe because they live in, with humans who are feeding them maybe typical foods that humans would eat. But I think about animals in the wild don't have bread, right? They don't make bread for them. There's no one cooking for them in the wild. So they say, right, or cooked meat, or we're going to see in a minute. But then they say, chaya, basar orchehu. What do you mean? Meat. They always eat meat. Wild animals. That's what they eat, right? They attack animals and eat the meat. So they say, demitve. No, we must be talking about, in other words, now we have a few ways to say this isn't talking about a donkey. Number one, maybe it's talking about chayot. Well, if it's talking about chayot, what about the meat? Well, we're talking about roasted meat, barbecue meat, okay? They don't eat barbecue meat. Nobody's barbecuing their meat for them. They eat raw meat. Or you could be talking about its tzvi. Maybe it's that kind of meat they don't eat. They don't eat meat of a deer, but they would eat other meat. Or this is very funny. It could be this is actually talking about domesticated animals, but it doesn't preclude us saying that it's strange for a donkey to eat, that a donkey would pay full damages for bread when it says here donkeys pay only half damages for bread, because this is talking about if the donkey came in where we were sitting around the table eating and came in and ate our food at the table, sat down at the table with us or stood up at the table with us and ate the food, that would be atypical, okay? So if a donkey walks into the neighbor's house and sits down at their table and starts eating dinner with them, that would be keren, okay? That would only be half damages because that's very unexpected. Whereas we were discussing a donkey who just ate, there was some bread laying around in the neighbor's garden and picked it up and ate it. That's different. Tura is the shulchan, is the table, so you know. Okay, starting out at the top of Daf Kat. Barcha, the chaza lifta apuma dedana. Kind of similar case, but a little bit different. We now have a goat who sees a turnip on top of a barrel, probably like an earthenware barrel. Climbed up, right, jumped up, climbed up onto the top of the barrel, ate the turnip, and broke the barrel. Rava says full damages for both. Now, why? Because what happened? Since we assume that they're going to eat turnips, now normally they don't climb up on top of barrels. That's not typical. But if the food is on top of the barrel, then they will climb on top of the barrel, and therefore eating the turnip was shame. Climbing on the barrel and breaking it is regel, because as it walked, it broke. So those are both classic typical damages of shame and regel, and you're liable full damages. There's nothing strange about this, even though it is strange for one to climb up on top of a barrel, but not if the food is on top there. Amar Ilfa, by the way, there's a few literary things in today's South. Ilfa and Alifta we just had, and there seems to be this connection. You might remember the famous story of Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan from Ta'anit, about that they wanted to go leave the Beit Midrash and start to work because they were very poor. And then Rabbi Yochanan hears voices and Ilfa didn't hear them, but saying, go back to the Beit Midrash. And he goes back and Ilfa doesn't. But then Ilfa, in the end of the story, tries to prove I still know Torah, even though I went to go work. Anyway, interesting story, but we're going to move on. This is what Ilfa said. Behema bereshut harabim. Now, remember, Shane, in the public domain, you're not liable. But Pashtat Savara, we're now going to see unique cases where we're going to view something in the public domain as private. And we're going to make the animal liable, the owner of the animal liable. So this animal sticks out its neck, leans over the next animal. The next animal has some food on its back and starts taking the food off the animal's back. Chayevet. Okay, in that case, that's shame because my time, since it's on the back of the other animal, it's considered like a private domain. We've seen this on Masechet Shabbat, that you could have a private domain in the public space. So this animal is considered like a private domain. And again, you would say also, it's not like I left my food in the middle of the street. I left it on top of an animal. I wasn't expecting that someone was going to eat it. And therefore, the animal is liable because they ate, right? Now, you could say, based on that logic, it would turn it into keren, which would only be chatzi nezek. But no. It's like I put it in a private domain in the public thoroughfare. So lema mesele, why don't we bring this Tanaitic source that would prove what Ilfa just said? Because Ilfa is an Amora, and if we could bring a Tanaitic source, it's even better. But then obviously we're going to reject this. I say obviously because usually when they say lema mesele, they usually reject it. Okay, someone's carrying a bundle on its back, and it's behind you. When the animal sticks his head in and starts eating your food. So that sounds like the same thing, right? It's on my shoulder. It's like a private domain. By the way, this is the same as saying my 4 cubits of space around me are like my own private domain. seen it a lot in halakha. So they say no. Rava somewhere else said it's a case where the animal jumped up and ate something. Likewise, here we're going to say it's bekofetzet, and that's already, now get this has nothing to do with Reshut Yachid. It's not because it's considered my own private space. It's because the animal did something strange, which is jump up to get food, right? We assume as the animal walks, the animal eats food, but not the animal jumping up. As soon as we do that, what happens? It becomes keren, which means, number one, liable in the public domain. Number two, it's only half damages though, okay? So then this doesn't really help us at all for what we're trying to prove. Now, what they did here is they said, just like Rava explained some other source as the case where the animal jumped, here also we'll say bekofetzet. They'll say the same thing here. So now they want to know, where did Rava say it's bekofetzet? Ahada Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, he said it on something Rabbi Yoshaya said. Rabbi Yoshaya said the following. He distinguished between another two cases. Behema bereshut harabim. Okay, classic case. You have an animal in reshut harabim, the public domain. Halcha v'achla p'tura. Okay, this is your classic din of shame. The animal's walking, and as it's walking, it eats, just like regel is as it's walking, it tramples. As it's walking, it eats. You're exempt because, again, that's expected behavior, and the owner should have known not to leave their food in the middle of the street. Amda v'achla chayevet. But if the animal stood and ate, you're liable. The owner is liable. So the Gemara asks, Ma'ishna halcha de'orchehu amdanami orchehu. Halcha is the typical way the animal walks. Well, an animal also stands in the public domain. They're not always in motion, and it is pretty typical the animal would stop to eat, right? I'm thinking when you're taking a walk and you take a drink, you usually stand and drink, right? You don't walk and drink. So the animal also theoretically might just stop to, to eat. So I'm a Rava bekofetzet. Rava says the only way Rabbi Yoshai could distinguish between these cases must be that Amda, what he means by standing is standing and then the animal jumped up or reached up higher, much higher to get something, which is atypical. And then that's why chayevet, because then it becomes keren and then you're liable. Okay, so then we're going to basically say that's the same thing here, which again means yes, you're liable in Reshut Harabim, but only because of keren, which means also half damages. And it's not what Ilfa was trying to say, which is it's actually shame because you've eaten from a different animal's back, which is considered a private domain, which makes it shame, full damages, and shame b'chatzar and izak. It's as if you're in the domain of the one who you damaged. And then it's shame, not keren. By Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera now asks a question. Mitgalgel ma. What if the food rolls from public domain to private domain? So again, liable in the private domain, not liable in the public domain. So what if it rolled from one to the other? Now, what do we mean by rolled? We mean the animal rolled it. Now we're going to see the case. Hechidam. Kigon de kaima amil bereshut harabim. By the way, if you want to talk sifruti literary, we're going to get back to amir later. An amir is a bundle of stack of hay or something. So there's an amir bereshut hayachid in a private domain. There's a stack of hay. And the animal rolls it into the public domain and then eats it in the public domain. Now, shame in the public domain is exempt, except the animal took it from the private domain. So this is, you would say, I don't know why the Gemara doesn't say this, but Batar achila, do we go by the eating, and the eating happened in the public domain, and therefore the owner is exempt? Or do we go by where he took it from, which, by the way, makes sense. We said he's chayim and reshut and nizak, because what was he doing going in there, right? And if you're only exempt, the reason you're exempt in public is because, again, there were different reasons. Either because the animal has a permission to be there, and therefore maybe it's okay, but the owner knew when they were leaving it in the public domain that someone was likely going to eat it. But in this case, it was in the private domain. So the animal takes it, rolls it into the public domain, and eats it. What do we go by? So Tashma, let's try to learn it from here. The Tani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia brings a source. Masui miktato b'fnim miktato b'chutz. If there's some, let's say a sack of, okay, the case Rashi is going to bring is a sack of barley. You have a sack of barley that's partly in and partly out. Partly in private domain, partly in public domain. Achla b'fnim chayevet, achla b'chutz p'tura. If the animal eats it inside in the private domain, then the owner is liable. If the animal eats it outside in the public domain, the owner is not liable. Now, what they assume happened here, and that's what the first reason, and that's why they're going to think this is going to answer our question. My lab mitgalga va'ate isn't the case where the bag was half in, half out. And let's say, we'll give both cases. The animal was standing inside. the private domain, rolled the entire thing inside and ate it, as he was eating, rolled it in, ate the whole thing in the private domain, fully responsible. Or if he rolls it into the public domain and eats the whole thing there, then he's not liable, even though it started in the private domain. So what do you see here? It all is determined by the moment of eating. And that would be your answer. But they say lo. That's not the only way to understand that source. Ema, read it like this. Achla, if the animal eats the whole bag of barley, let's say, it all goes by where was it at the moment when the animal took it. So the animal could be anywhere. The animal could be in the private domain, the public domain, roll the whole thing into that space. It doesn't make a difference. On the half that was in the private domain, the owner's liable. On the half that was originally in the public domain, the owner's not liable because it was in the public domain. In which case, right, so the owner's going to be liable, let's say, for 50%, assuming it was 50-50. And that would prove, and again, this is just an alternate reading, so we really don't have a proof in the end, but that would side on saying it all goes where the owner left it and where the animal took it from. So that would prove the opposite. Or a third option is could be it's not talking about a barrel of barley, okay? In which case it won't teach us about that type of a case. But what might it be talking about? Stalks of hay or straw or something like that, where it's a long stalk. Half of it is in private, half of it is in public. Now, in this case, it would be much more obvious if we go back to our first explanation, wherever the animal eats it, now the animal starts eating the stalk. Now, obviously, the stalk gets pulled, but it's not the same as barley that was half here, half there, and the animal rolled all the individual granules of barley that were in one domain into the other. No, this is a case where as the animal's eating it, the rest of it gets pulled with it. But we basically would obviously then go by wherever the animal is. If the animal's eating on the side that's in his domain, right, in public, and the animal just ends up eating the whole thing because it's all attached, we're going to just, since it's attached, we're going to just view it as that was in the public domain. And if it was private, we'll view it as private. But that doesn't teach you about if there was something in the other domain and the animal pulled it into that domain. That wouldn't be the same thing because this was one piece. It could have been several pieces, it doesn't matter, but each piece was half in, half out. And that's a whole different situation. So basically, we don't end up with an answer to this question. Next, we want to go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had the beginning of the Mishnah basically had three sentences, ignoring the first one, which let's just say was the question, then, or a quote from the previous Mishnah in the previous chapter. But then it says, the behema is mu'edet le'echol perot v'yarkot. Typical shame behavior, eating fruits and vegetables. Atypical behavior, eating suit and kelim, right? Clothes, vessels. And then you only pay half damages that we call keren. The third line was, in what case is this? Only in the private domain. But in the public domain, one is exempt. Now, the way we read it when we read the Mishnah was that third line is explaining line number one, but not line number two, because keren is liable anywhere. Right? Private, public, it doesn't make a difference. So the Gemara is not so sure about that, though. And Rav and Shmuel are going to disagree, and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are going to have the same debate between Rav and Shmuel. Ahaya, on which line, and I set it up in the study guide, right? There's three sentences. 3 is going on 1 or on 1 and 2. So Amarav Akulu, it's referring to both 1 and 2. And now the basic thing you have to explain is, why is keren going to be exempt in the public domain? Keren is always liable in the public domain. So my timer, he says, well, why is keren liable in the public domain? Because, right, the animal's doing something atypical, and, right, theoretically, on the one hand, one expects, right, animals could damage and could do unexpected things in the public domain, and therefore, right, and basically what we're going to say is, on the one hand, we weren't expecting it, so only half damages. On the other hand, since it's unexpected, so wherever you are, we're going to make you liable for them because it's unexpected damages, and unexpected damages, right? In other words, it's not like shame. Shame is, why'd you leave your stuff there, right? What were you thinking? But now we're saying, no, you left your stuff because food. Food gets eaten, that was yours to expect. If your ox gets gored in the public domain, you weren't expecting that to happen. What, you can't let your ox walk around in the public domain? That's not your problem. Your ox is allowed to walk as well as my ox. So if my ox gores your ox in Reshut HaRabim, that's my problem, not yours. Now, again, it's only chatzi nezik because I wasn't expecting it, but it's not like you expected it, and therefore it was okay for your animal to be there, and therefore you're going to get compensated. But now we have something else. So let's go back to the kelim and the clothes. You left clothes. Now, you didn't expect the animal to come eat them, right? However, you did something odd. Nobody leaves clothes and vessels in the middle of the street. So since you did something strange, now again, what did we say? Keren is unexpected, okay? But when you do something strange, you did something strange, and then my animal did something strange. Now, why did my animal do something strange? Because something was off. He saw something weird. He saw these clothes in the street, so he started looking at them and decided to eat them. Well, that already is your fault for leaving it and doing something weird. Okay, it's a little strange to think why, and we're going to see at the end of the sugya, someone's going to suggest leaving clothes and vessels is actually not a strange thing. But right now, the Gemara thinks that's an odd thing, and that's Rav's explanation. Not that they're going to say that's the machloket, basically, between Rav and Shmuel here. Is it atypical to do this kind of thing or not atypical? So again, once the owner of the damaged ox or damaged clothing here does something odd, and then the mazik comes and the animal goes and attacks, does something to it, eats it, that already makes basically the owner not responsible of the animal because you changed something that caused my animal to do it. It's almost like it's your fault, even though it's not really, but it's somewhat. Right? You can think about, if you think about it in this way, like little kids are like this also. Something is different, right? It throws them off. That's the concept here. Shmuel Amar, what are you talking about? About ksut v'kelim chayevet, but of course you're liable for ksut and kelim. Okay, that's atypical and that's keren. So you're going to obviously be liable in the public domain. And therefore, sentence number 3 is really only defining sentence number 1. It's like they got sidetracked to keren and then they went back to shame, which was the subject of our mission. V'chein amar Rish Lakish akulu. Okay, and Rish Lakish also said, this is referring to everything. Right, like Rav. Va'az de Rish Lakish the tameh. And Rish Lakish is consistent because he says something else similar in a different scenario. De amal Rish Lakish, it's the exact same concept. Shtei parot b'reshut harabim. Okay, so let's go back to our typical Ruth and Naomi. Ruth has an ox that's going to gore Naomi's ox. Okay, but there's going to be 2 different scenarios in which this happens, and it's in the public domain. Echad rivutza ve'echad mahalech. Okay, one of their animals is crouching, and the other one is walking. Now we're going to see both options. Now, it's normal for an animal to walk in the public domain. It's not typical for the animal to crouch. So, if Naomi's ox crouches down and Ruth's ox comes and kicks it, now again, it was crouching down. It was doing something odd. So therefore, that's what possibly caused Ruth's ox to kick it, in which case, right, it's going to be p'tura. Why is it p'tura? Because again, we're not going to make you responsible for that because that's kol ha-mishaneh, even though really it should be keren, but kol ha-mishaneh, right? Naomi's ox changed by crouching, ba'achir v'shinabo, and then Ruth's ox does something atypical. Well, she did something atypical to somebody who was acting in an atypical manner, and that would make her exempt. Rivutza b'mahalechet chayev. But if the one who crouched, Ruth's ox was crouching, and then from a crouching position kicked, well, if Naomi's ox was just walking normally, obviously she's going to be chayevet because we don't care that Ruth's ox was crouching. The whole issue was, did the one who became damaged, were they doing something odd? And she was doing something totally normal. So that's the same idea. So now they say Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Shmuel though. Lo shanu hu ama. Lo shanu ela perot v'yarakot. Ksut v'kelim chayevet. An animal eats ksut and kelim, of course you're going to be liable. That's keren. And he doesn't have this concept of kol ha-mishaneh, although maybe he does. Let's see. Now they say, Lema Rabbi Yochanan, lately the Rish Lakish, afilu b'shtei parot. Are we going to say that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't agree with this Rish Lakish thing? That anyone who changes, messes things up? To which they say, lo. You don't necessarily have to say that. You could say that he agrees in the cow case. But what? But what? He just doesn't think, and this is what I said we're going to conclude at the end. He doesn't not conclude, but we could say, he doesn't think that leaving ksut and kelim in the middle of the street is odd. He says lots of times people want to go rest and they put down their cloak. It's very common. So the fact that the cloak was in Rishut Rabim is not actually an uncommon occurrence. And therefore, it doesn't come into this category of anyone who changes. And then the machloket becomes, what's the reality of this case? Is it odd? Is it not odd? But maybe everyone does agree, though, if it is odd, then the other animal acts oddly, we're not going to make them responsible in the public domain. Now we want to get back to this issue of benefiting. And we're going to get into a very, very famous sugya. As soon as we see it, hopefully you'll recognize it. If not, well, you'll enjoy it because it's a really interesting sugya. So right now they're going to talk about benefiting from eating. So again, we said Shane in the public domain is exempt, except if my animal benefited and now I don't have to feed, and not only did he benefit, but I benefited because I don't have to pay the money now to feed them, well, I have to pay masha nehenei. So they say, Kamma, how do we evaluate? Rabba Amal Dmei Amir, I told you we get back to this Amir. He said, it's the amount of, a stack of hay, stack of straw, whatever that like simple, basic food an animal would eat. Rabba Amar Dmei Se'olim Bizol. He said, no. Animals also eat grains of barley. That you have to go up a level, not just the basic, but something else that's pretty basic, which is the value of barley, like the amount that you would have fed him instead of the amount that he ate. Bizol. For a cheap price, though, meaning not the market rate, but a third less, some of the commentaries say a third less than the market rate, because, he could have grown them on his own. He could have gotten them wholesale. So basically, we're going to lower that a little bit. It's still more than the Dmei Amir, but that's what Rava said. So now, Tanya Kavatei Rabba, Tanya Kavatei Rabba. We have these two opinions. We're now going to bring a braita to support each. Tanya Kavatei Rabba, de Rabba with a hey, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Em Shalem et El Dmei Amir Bilvad. All you have to pay is the basic, animal fodder price. Tanya Kavatei de Rava, for the second one, this is a little bit of a longer braita. Im nehanet Mishalem et masha nehanet. So you pay the value you benefit in this braita, it says. Ketzad, how do we do that? Achla kavo kabayim, we go by the volume of how much you ate. Ein omrim, right, that's a measurement of volume. Ein omrim tishalem demand. You don't have to give the value, right? I gave an example yesterday of caviar. You have to give kav or kabayim of caviar, but ela umdim kama adam rotzeh la'achil be'em tod davar ha'ro'ila afal pi she'eino ragil. Now, it doesn't really say what this means, but the assumption is, Rashi says, even though you don't necessarily feed your animal barley, but since many people feed their animal barley, we're going to make that what you have to pay back. Hey, even if that's not what your animal normally ate. Lefichach, now there's a separate line, doesn't relate. We're already done with what we brought. It relates to it, but not to what we were looking for here, the support for Rabba. But the last line of this braita is, Lefichach hachlach hitim o davar harala p'tura. If your animal ate food, but it was bad for them, okay? Wheat apparently are bad for animals. If the animal ate something that's bad for it, then there's no hana'ah, there's no benefit. And because there's no benefit, so you don't have to pay at all. Amar le Rav Chisda le Rami bar Chama. Here it starts our interesting sugya. Rav Chisda says to Rami bar Chama, Lo hadid gavam be'orta b'tchuma. You weren't in the area we were in last night when we had this fascinating Ibayla mila ma'aliyata. We asked a very important question. Amar my mila ma'aliyata. He said, what great question did you ask yesterday? Right? Rav Chisda is probably saying, I didn't realize you were going to ask me. Okay. Amar le hadar b'chatzar chavero shalom midato tzarich la'alot lo sachar o ein tzarich. So we asked him the following question. Somebody, okay, this is a squatter. A squatter comes, and what are they basically doing? Living in someone else's courtyard without their knowledge. Do they have to pay them rent or not? Okay, so now the Gemara is going to have to figure out what are the details of the scenario. They're going to bring three options, reject the first two, and say we're obviously talking about the third. Hechidan. If we're talking about a courtyard that wasn't up for rent, okay, let's say go back to Ruth and Naomi. So I'm trying to think who fits where. I don't know. Okay, Naomi has a courtyard, and Ruth walks into the courtyard and decides to live there. Now, okay, it could be a house, it could be anything. So let's just say a house. It's easier, even though they use chatzer. So now, Ruth goes into the courtyard, starts living there. Naomi was not planning to rent it out, and Ruth happens to have another house. She just passed by, saw this, looked nice. She said, you know what, I'm going to camp out here. So, there's really no hana'ah to Ruth because she has another house. She wasn't looking to go renting somewhere. And Naomi is not losing anything because it's not like she's trying to rent it to somebody else. What if it's Naomi was trying to rent out the space, and Ruth was looking to rent a house. And in the end, Ruth just comes and camps out in Naomi's house that was up for rent. So obviously, Ruth is benefiting, and Naomi is losing out. So obviously, she has to pay. There's no question. The question is, we have Naomi, who actually is looking to rent, but Ruth is not looking to rent out her space. So this is a classic, right? Can Naomi say, look, Ruth can say, look, I'm not making you lose out on anything, Naomi. I hope I didn't say the reverse before, but anyway, Naomi's the one whose house it is, and Ruth is the one camping there. I'm sorry, I think I said it the opposite. I'm sorry for confusing you if I did. Anyway, so Naomi, this is her place, but Ruth could say to her, look, you weren't planning to rent it, so what's the difference, right? I'm not making you lose anything. Oh, Dilma, Matze Amrla, or maybe she could say, turning out I'm a bit, Hi Tanya, Hi Tanit. Now we could say, look, it's true, I wasn't planning to rent it out, but you're benefiting. Pay me what you're benefiting. Now you can see the connection, right? Here they benefited, even though they're not supposed to pay for damages, they did benefit, so they pay. Okay, you can already start thinking, is it really the same or not? So this is what, notice the Gemara doesn't say this yet, but soon they're going to call it Zenehene. Well, no, because they did say before, Zenehene v'zelo, right? So now they're going to say, right, this is a case of Zenehene v'zelo chaser. Okay, one is benefiting, Ruth is benefiting, but Naomi is not losing out anything. So does she have to compensate her or not? Now, this is all I want to point out before we move on. This is all shalomi data. This is all if she does it without Ruth's knowledge. If without Naomi's knowledge. Now, why? What if Naomi knew? Well, if Naomi knew, it's very obvious. If Naomi knew, there's two options. Either Naomi said, get out of my house, in which case, if Ruth doesn't get out of her house, of course she's going to need to pay. If she knows and doesn't say anything, then obviously she doesn't care that Ruth is living there and she can't demand rent. So there it becomes a more clear scenario. This is obviously, and that's what it says. The question was shalomi data. If Ruth didn't know about it, if Naomi didn't know about it, then the question is, does Ruth have to pay her or not? So Amarle, Rami Brahama says, I can't believe you struggle with this question. It's very simple. Matnitin it's a Mishnah. Hey, matnitin, which Mishnah? Amarle, l'chiti shamishli. Okay, so interestingly, he answers him, first do something for me, then I'll let you know the answer. It's a very weird scenario here. Shaka sudre karachle. It's even stranger. What does he do to serve him? He doesn't bring him a cup of wine or something, you would think, or something like that, or, work in his house, but he takes his scarf and he folds it for him. And that's enough. And then Rabbi Braham is already willing to give him the answer. Amar le im nehenet mishalem masha nehenet. What does our Mishnah say? If you benefited, right, you're not really liable, but if you got benefit, you have to pay for the benefit that you receive. So there you go. There's your answer. Ruth benefited from living in that house because she didn't have to rent another space. So that was benefit to her, that just like the food. Right now, you don't have to pay for lunch for your animal. So likewise, Ruth doesn't have to pay rent somewhere else. She benefited. She has to pay the amount she benefited. Rava hears this response and he says, this is insane. And he says, he introduces it in a very interesting way. I'll start with the end of the sentence. A person that God helps, the person that God is fond of, will not get sick and will not feel any pain or anything. Meaning, if God is on your side, you're in good shape. Why? What does that have to do with anything? Even though Rami Braham made this comparison, which is totally not true. And yet Rav Chisda accepted it. So what do you see? First of all, this is the interesting thing that we all see all the time, which is that when you have someone who's, a very well-respected person, they could say anything and people will probably just take what they said without really thinking about it because they'll say, oh, if they said it, it must be true. Okay, even though that's not always right. So why was it wrong? So I hope you thought about this comparison already. It's not a fair comparison. Hi, zenehenev is a chaser. That's not a case of zenehenev is elo chaser. In the Mishnah, Ruth's animal ate Naomi's food. That means that Naomi is chaser. She's missing now the food. That she took a loss on that. It was her food. Naomi's ox ate it. So zenehenev is a chaser. Okay, that's different. So, hi, our case is Ruth benefited. Naomi didn't lose anything. So what that Ruth was in her house? It didn't make a difference. It doesn't take anything off of Naomi. So it's no loss whatsoever. So now we have to explain, what was Rami bar Chama thinking? I mean, he was a very smart person. He must have had some thinking there. Well, Rami bar Chama would have to say, Stam perot bereshut harabim afkure mefker lehu. If Naomi left her fruits in the middle of the public thoroughfare, and Ruth, because that's what we're talking about, right? Ruth's ox ate it. What was the whole idea? Well, Naomi can't complain, right? There's no shame here because it's public. But if Ruth benefited, Ruth's ox benefited, which then causes benefit to Ruth. She doesn't have to feed her ox lunch. She has to compensate Naomi somehow. Now, that could be a case of Zen Nevezelo Chasir, because once she put it in the public domain, she basically made it ownerless. So she wasn't really expecting to get it back, in which case it was worth zero to her. So the fact that she's getting something is a case of Zen Nevezelo Chasir. Okay, but the Gemara's Rava at least is not so happy with that as an answer. And we're going to look further. So this was our first attempt to answer the question, our basic question. You're a squatter. Do you have to pay? Can we make you pay? So the first attempt was to say yes, based on our Mishnah, but then we said they're not comparable cases. Tanan, second attempt. Hamakiv chavero mishalosh uchotav v'gadar et harishona v'et hashniya v'et hashlishit ein mechayvin oto. If you have a regular Gemara, there's a picture in Rashi. Basically, I'm living in a field in the middle of your field. Okay, your field, I'm like a little box in the middle. You surround me on all four sides. Now, you presumably have a fence around the whole property, but you also want a fence in between my property and yours. So you build a fence on 3 of the 4 sides. I don't have to pay at all, even though I'm benefiting from the fence. Why? Because I'm not really benefiting from the fence, because you only closed it in on 3 sides. There's still one side open, which means your animals can run into my field freely. So you haven't really done anything for me. But notice what it says there. First, second, and third side, I don't have to pay the costs for. But ha-rivi'it, that would infer that you can infer from here, rivi'it, the 4th side, mechayvinoto, I will have to pay. Once you totally close me in and protect my field, I have to pay. Now, what does it mean? I have to share the costs, right? So I have to share the costs of the gate, the fence now. Shmamina, this happened to me, by the way. My neighbor put up a nice fence, okay? Now, it was a fence between our properties, but they decided to put it up. It wasn't any loss for me. Now, I did gain because I now have a nice fence between our properties, but I didn't ask for it, and they were doing it anyway, so it's Zen Nevezelo Chasil. So according to this, I would have to pay because it also helped my property. To which they say, no, no, this is different. Once, let's say I'm in the inside and you're in the outside. Once you do all 4 sides and I have to pay, why do I have to pay? Because you can say to me, listen, I already put a fence around my whole property. Were it not for you living in the middle, I wouldn't have to do anything. So it's your fault that I had to build this fence, and therefore they can make me liable. Okay? So that could be a reason to say this is different than normal. Okay, so the first 2 attempts I just want to point out were to say you are responsible, but both are rejected. Now we're going to have 2 attempts to say you're not responsible. Tashma, well, in that same source, the continuation says, Amar Rabbi Yossi, im amad nikaf, if I, as the one who you were putting up the fences, you did 3, and then I stood up and did the 4th. B'gadarat harivi'it migalgalim alav et hakol. Now they say, the first one, you put up 3, and then you put up the 4th, I have to share on the cost of the 4th. The 4th one was the one that made the difference. According to Rabbi Yossi, if I put up the 4th one myself, then I have to share in half of everything. Okay? Tama, now what does this seem to imply? Digadar nikaf. According to Rabbi Yossi, he disagrees with Tanakama, and he thinks, hamakif patur. If you did it, though, the 4th, I wouldn't have to pay anything. Shma mina zen nevezelo chaser patur. Sounds like, at least according to Rabbi Yossi, obviously he disagrees with Tanakama. According to Rabbi Yossi, since you built the 4 fences, I didn't ask for it. I don't have to pay anything. So there, you could have an answer, at least according to Rabbi Yossi. To which they say, no. Shane hatam damarle. Okay, let's take my neighbor's fence. My neighbor put in a very nice fence, probably hired a worker to do it for them, cost them a pretty penny. I could say, yes, it's very nice. Maybe I do have to pay, but you know what? You paid a lot of money for the materials. You paid a worker to do it. I would have done it myself. I would have found cheaper materials. I would have been happy with a very cheap. You could always come up with something inexpensive to put in between. The fact that you paid all this money, that doesn't mean I have to pay for it. Okay, and therefore, again, it's an exception. It's not the same as our case. The fourth source. Again, we're going to try to say exempt. Tashma. Habayit va'aliyah shel shnayim shenaflu. You live in the downstairs, I live in the upstairs. Whole house comes crashing down. Now, I want to go back to living upstairs, but what's the problem? You don't want to rebuild your house. You don't have the money, whatever it is. You didn't pay for insurance. So Amar Baal, now I can't build the second floor without the first floor, right? So Amar Baal Aliyah Lebal Abayit, leave note. I said to you, go build your downstairs so I can build my upstairs. And you say, I'm not interested. I can take, because the land is basically both, right, belongs to me and you. I can build a house on the bottom floor, the first floor, and live there until you pay me back what I spent. Okay, when you pay me back what I spent, I'll go and build the upper floor, right? They don't give any fact that, okay, I dealt with the shiputznik and I dealt with the renovations and all that. They don't seem to think that's an issue. But anyway, you pay me back and then I can go build upstairs. Now, what does it say here? All you have to do, you have to give me what I spent. But it doesn't say you can deduct from there the rent. I was really renting out your space. You own the downstairs. So why aren't you charging me rent? This is a case again of I'm benefiting. You're not losing anything because just like before, Naomi wasn't interested in renting the house. Here, Naomi wasn't interested in building the house, or me I was the upstairs. You were the downstairs. You weren't interested in building the downstairs. So therefore, you weren't chaser anything. They say no. Shane hatam. So again, then you would say, it looks like I'm exempt because you didn't charge me rent for this. They say, no, Shane hatam debate ala aliyah mishtabit. Now this is different because the house is connected to the second floor. Without the first floor, there is no second floor. But basically, we both own the space. The airspace, right, of the downstairs at this point became the airspace of the upstairs to a certain extent. And therefore, there was no rent to be paid because this is my land also. Okay, and therefore that's why. So that's not a good reason to say I'm exempt. Now we're going to go to source number 5, our last source, and try to say the opposite, which is obligated. Tashma, there it says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, okay, about this case of the aliyah, this is like living in someone's, he actually compares it exactly, like living in someone's house without their knowledge, and they have to pay them rent. It sounds like you're liable. So he says, no. It's only in this case. Why? Because I just built a brand new house, and you're going to have to pay me all the money for the new house. But in the end, you're not going to get a new house because you're going to get a house with blackened walls, because when they lit fires, it blackened the walls. Now, in the case of the squatter was going either living in something that wasn't built or living in something built that was old, which anyway had blackened walls. Okay, we're assuming, which is an interesting assumption, there's not much wear and tear on an old house. It's only on a new house. So in the end, you can deduct because you're getting something that's not as good as it was, for your amount that you're going to have to pay me for it. And again, exception to the rule doesn't teach anything. Now, the saga continues. Shalchu be Rabbi Ami. They asked Rabbi Ami this question. Amal, look, right? Ruth was living in Naomi's property. What did she do to her? What did she make her lose out on? What did she damage? Nothing. So of course she doesn't have to pay anything. So he thinks it's very clear. But they weren't so happy with his answer. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar, they asked Rabbi Chiya bar Abba as well. And Amal nityashev badavar. He said, I need to think about it. It's not so simple. Hadran shalchuah kamed Rabbi Chiya bar Abba. Now Rabbi Chiya bar Abba didn't answer them. So they sent again to him. What's the situation? Amar, Kulu, hi, shalach li ba'aza. Why do you keep bothering me about this question? Ilu eshkachei batama, lo shalachna. What do you think if I had an answer, I wouldn't send it to you? Leave me alone. I'm thinking about it. I need some time to think. Okay, Itmar. Again, more machlokot. And this is going to be a debate about what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rav Kahana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Kahana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Eino tzarich lo sachar. Ruth does not have to pay. She's a squatter. No need to pay at all. Rabbi Yavau, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tzarich lo sachar. But Rabbi Yavau said that Rabbi Yochanan said you have to pay. So now, Amar Rav Papa, hi to Rabbi Abba, lav beferish itmar elamich lal itmar. We want you to know that what Rabbi Avau said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan It's not that Rabbi Yochanan said it explicitly. He inferred it from Rabbi Yochanan. And he was, in the end, we're going to say, sometimes we say, and he was wrong about it. Sometimes we have that somebody says something in someone's name, but it's inferred from somewhere. And then it was a mistake. Sometimes it was inferred and it's correct. But this, we're going to say it was inferred and a mistake. Why? It's not. Natal even o korah shel hekdesh. Now we have a guy who's the treasurer of the temple. He takes a stone or a beam that was hekdesh, hareze lo ma'al, just by picking it up, putting it in his house. He didn't really do anything with it. And he's kind of in charge of all the hekdesh stuff anyway. So how do you know he was using it for his own sake? So there's no me'ila, misuse of consecrated property. Nitana lechavero hu ma'al, chavero lo ma'al. But if he gives it as a gift to someone, well, then that's leaving his domain. And then he's liable for misuse of consecrated property. If you remember what happens, the property then turns into chulin. So therefore, chavero lo ma'al. If the friend uses it, they're actually not liable in me'ila, because by misusing consecrated property, you basically say, I'm treating it like it's chol, and it actually turns it into chol, which is not sanctified. So only he's me'ila, not the friend. Okay, that's not so relevant yet. If he uses the beam or the stone as a wall in his house and puts it up inside a wall, until you live under it, the value of a shapapruta. Just by putting it in your wall, or we're going to see now in the ceiling, doesn't mean that you're going to benefit from it. Only once you actually use the house. By putting it there, because what have you done? You haven't changed anything. You just have a stone. You can always take the stone out. Nothing happened. Once you live in the house, you've actually benefited. Then you're liable for me'ila. V'amar Shmuel, and here's the important part. Shmuel says, this is when you put it as, you fit it into the hole. There's like a sky roof, what do you call it? It's like a hole in the roof, a skylight, thank you. But it's not, there's no window there, and you stuck this to basically block that in. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. The yet of Rabbi Yavau came to Rabbi Yochanan. Now here comes Rabbi Yavau and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yavau was sitting in front of Rabbi Yochanan, but Kamma mishmei de Shmuel, and he says in the name of Shmuel, Zot omeret hadar b'chatzar chavero shelo midato tzarich la'alo lo sachar. Now he says, now at this point, okay, what's the issue with the aruba? Rashi says, Lo kav'a b'binyan de lo have shinoi. The important part is he didn't change this. If he put it as part of the building, it would be a shinoi, because it's using a stone as a wall. If you just use it as a stone to close up this, there's no shinoi. That's why you're only liable then. Now, Rashi continues, it says, Zot omeret, from the fact that it says, Chidar tachteh chayav apapi shalom midat hekdesh abad. Behekdesh leka lememar shalom midat. This is the important part. We're going to get to that in a minute. Sorry. Okay, so now he's going to say, Hadar b'chatzal chavero shalom midato tzarich la'alo lo sachal. Because what? He's basically using God's items without asking. And what do you see here? He has to pay. Okay, even though God is not missing anything, because in the end, he can take the stone and bring it to the temple. So he hasn't actually caused a loss at all. So it's zenenet v'zelo chaser. Vishatakle. And Rabbi Yochanan was silent. Now, iu savar midashatik modele. He thought that the silence was admitting, you're right. And that's why he said, Rabbi Yavau and Rabbi Yochanan tzarich la'alo lo sachal. Because he said chayav, and he said this, and but v'lohi. Eshkuchi lo eshkach be kederabba. He said, no, he was just ignoring him. Why was he ignoring him? Because he held like Rabbah. Rabbah says, hekdesh shalom midat kehedyo midat ami. And he basically says, hekdesh without knowledge. What do you mean? There's no such thing as hekdesh without knowledge. It's not like without the knowledge of God. God knows everything. Because God knows everything, this turns it into a case of midat, as if they know, and that's why you have to pay. Now, so what? If they know and they didn't say anything, right? God didn't respond, but they say, I go with Tosfot over Rashi here, but anyway, you can look at Rashi, but Tosfot says, since, like, obviously God doesn't want you to use, that's what me'ila is. Me'ila is, don't use my property without asking, anytime you use my property, I'm going to punish you. So obviously God meant no way, no how, and that's why you have to pay. But don't learn from here, and therefore when Rabbi Yavau said that Rabbi Yochanan said, you're chayav, he was wrong. He just didn't realize that when Rabbi Yochanan didn't respond, it was because Rabbi Yochanan totally disagreed and not because Rabbi Yochanan agreed with him. So that's it for today. We're going to continue with this topic of Hadar b'chatzar chavero shalom midato, a very fascinating topic. And just a quick review, we started our daf with all these cases of Shane, and when Shane in Rishut Rabim could potentially be chayav, when it turns into Rishut Yachid, when the animal rolls it, what's the situation? How much you have to pay if you benefit. And then from there, we got into benefiting without causing a loss to anyone else, even though that wasn't really a fair comparison to our Mishnah. And we tried 5 sources to try to get to an answer. We didn't have an answer. Then we saw some psikot halacha, and people who held one way or the other about whether you're liable or you're not liable to have to pay. Okay, if in the end, by the way, I want you to notice that in the end, you have Rabbi Ami who says, no, you don't. And then you have the quote in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the only one that was really correct was, no, you don't have to pay. Okay, so that's just interesting, at least at this point in the sugya. It seems to be siding with a squatter doesn't really have to pay. But we'll see where we end up tomorrow. Wishing everybody a great day and hoping for good news.